Hello, I am Mark Murray-Flutter. I'm a Senior Curator for Firearms, and today I would like to introduce you to a weapon known as the Welrod, and this is up in arms. The story of the Welrod is an iconic story. It's one of those weapons that permeate the history of firearms. They're often thought of as secret agent sort of guns, but in fact they are not. Before I launch into the story of the Welrod, it's important to introduce you to an organisation which was founded and operated in the Second World War, known as the Special Operations Executive, the acronym being SOE. The story of the Welrod is intertwined very much with the story of SOE. And Special Operations Executive was set up on the order to Churchill in June 1940, in effect to support and supply what was going to be, hopefully, resistance in Europe against the Germans. One of the things which SOE was tasked with doing was supporting what was known as the resistance, and also what was also referred to as Patriot forces. Patriot forces were those which were more organised, like the Maquis in France, and the resistance were more covert. And the Welrod, of course, played an important part with both these sorts of organisations. Now, as part of SOE, there was some research and development elements, and the ones I'm particularly interested in here is their R&D centre, what's known as Station 9, and their developmental and production centre known as Station 12. Both sited near the city of Welwyn, the town of Welwyn, in the county of Hertfordshire, and it was here that the Welrods were born. In about September 1942, there was a requirement set out by both SOE and indeed Combined Operations, that is the commandos and those units which were tasked with conducting what's referred to as over-the-beach operations on the shores of Europe, for a silent pistol capable of dispatching sentries quietly, that sort of thing. So, knowing what the requirement was, SOE set about developing what turned out to be the Welrod. The name is interesting as well, and we'll just explore that quickly. You can split it into two parts. Well stands for Welwyn, and there are numerous bits of equipment developed at these sites which carried that well element. The well bum, the well swimmer, the well mine, the well gun even. But the well rod had the name rod attached to it, probably because it looks like a bicycle pump or a rod, as you can see. So it became known as the Welrod. Technically speaking, I have two here. On the your left, my right, I have the Mark II .32 version. This one, unfortunately, is a replica example, as I am unable to show you a proper example as it carries radioactive sights. The one on the left is the 9mm Welrod Mark I, which came into being much later in the war, if not at the very end of the war. So, let's explore that story. The development was carried out by three individuals, a Major Hugh Reeves, an engineer called Eric Norman, and what's referred to in SOE's parlance as extramural consultant F.T. Bridgman, based in Cambridge. Between them, they developed the first of the Welrods, which was a trials example, which came into being over the winter of 1942 into 1943. It was tested. It wasn't overly successful. It had to go away for redesign, which it was. And this redesign came out again in July 1943 and was tested and approved. And it is in fact the Mark II and Mark IIA version, which we now have, we are showing you, which came into being. And they were available probably to be issued for use late 43 all the way through 44 and into 45. People ask a very simple question, which is how many were ever made and who made them? Well, let's answer that. Firstly, they were manufactured by a British company in Birmingham called the Birmingham Small Arms Company. You won't find any markings to indicate that, but they were. We know that, and we know what the contract was for these. How many were made? Well, the Mark II and IIA 32 caliber, we know that the contract was for 15,000. The follow-on question is always, how many were actually used in the war? Well, we can actually answer that because I happen to know how many were left in store at the end of the war. So from that, we can make a very good guess, if not quite accurate guess, as to how many were actually issued. And that number is roughly 11,000. Survival rates, very small. To my knowledge, and I have done a lot of research around these, there are only around about 200 of the 32 calibers left in existence. There may be more hidden away, but that's what we believe is the case. Their function was to assist agents and commandos, and it's really difficult finding information about their use because they're supposed to be covert, so people don't really talk about them or photograph them in their use. But we have some evidence, some indication of what they were used for. We know that they were employed by liaison officers, SOE liaison officers in Albania and Yugoslavia. We know that they were dropped in some numbers into Denmark, Holland and Norway. And in fact, the story of the Welrod in Denmark is particularly interesting because it was not only used by the Danish resistance to assassinate those Germans they didn't like, but conversely, captured ones were also used by a special German unit set up by Otto Skorzeny to assassinate resistance fighters. So that's a fascinating little use of the item. They were used in France, but there's not a huge amount of evidence of how they were used. Likewise, we know that they were in Poland, for instance. And let's not forget that there were more theatres than just the Mediterranean and the North European theatres, because they were deployed in some numbers in India, in the Far East and in the Pacific Theatre. And indeed, the Australians, when they issued some of these, also suggested that the Welrod was an excellent survival pistol. It was silent, therefore you can take out game very quietly. And that's its key function. That's what's most important about this particular item. It was silent, or as we say, suppressed. And its noise signature is relatively small. You probably would not hear it 30 to 50 meters away at all. It was very akin to snapping wood, that sort of noise. It is single shot because that means there are no moving parts. It was always intended that the user would only need to use one shot, only a second one in extremis. The magazine is housed in the butt, this bit here, and there would be 5 rounds in that magazine. So that is the stock of ammunition that you may have. It is operated by a bolt which is hand operated. I'll try and indicate, like so. So it's usually dark in colour. The difference between these two is this is the one on my right, your left, is a complete unit. The one on my left, the Mark I 9mm, comes apart into 2 parts. This was the next development. It was designed so it could be used as a silent weapon, but also as a regular pistol. It would also break down for concealment. So having spoken a bit about their use, the 32, think about it as in use during the war. The 9mm versions came into production in January, February 1945, finishing production in August 1945. So, and we only produced roughly 6,000 of these, and very few, a handful, may have got into the hands of users during the war. The majority of these would have been used in the Cold War, the war between what was to be the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, and the West and NATO. And one of the key elements of this particular Mark I, which I find particularly interesting, is it was deployed in small numbers in hides around Europe for stay-behind units in case the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe. And the idea was that these stay-behind units could then dig up these weapons from their hides and then create havoc in the rear areas of the advancing Russians. So that was the purpose of those. This particular one here I have has no sights on it, because the sights would normally be radioactive. They would be covered in radium, and radium allows one to see in the dark a little bit, so you can make use of it in twilight and in darkness. But this particular one has had those sights removed by a previous user, the purpose of which is lost in time. And these probably were used by units probably into the 90s, maybe a bit later. It is difficult to know. But their Cold War lineage is well known. Both the Americans deployed them in Berlin. The Brits deployed them in their hides in Austria. And we know that some of these were used in Vietnam as well. You might wonder why we were using silent weapons or suppressed weapons. Well, clearly you need them for some covert activities, the removal of sentries, as I've said, or possibly assassination, or the removal of dogs, guard dogs, that sort of thing, something you want to do without creating too much noise. And that idea of silence, or the requirement for silence, continued post-war, and there are quite a few examples of silent and suppressed weapons, both for the civilian world but also in the military world. There are, for instance, the Russians have an example, the Chinese have an example, the Americans have an example. And this, of course, was the British example. But today, in the 21st century, we have moved on. We have much more efficient suppressors. We have different firearms which use them. And most of the time, we now add a suppressor to a firearm rather than have it integral to it. So that's where we are today, and they are still there. They're still out there, and no doubt you, the listener and the viewer, will be aware of a fair different number of examples. You may wonder why I'm talking about the Welrod. Well, these have fascinated me through most of my working life. I find them interesting, not so much technically for what they are, although that has an interest. It is what they stand for, what they represent in terms of an organisation, and talking about here SOE, Special Operations Executive, and how they had to develop special equipment to conduct particular types of operations, of which this is an excellent example. It could have been switches, explosive switches, or special devices for blowing up trains, or underwater limpet mines to attach to ships, or one of the more extraordinary items known as the nail gun, which was designed so you could affix a limpet to either a wooden ship or indeed a metal ship. And these were still in use in the 70s, for instance. So these are all very fascinating in terms of why they were developed and what their intent was. It doesn't mean it changed the nature of warfare in any way, shape or form, or indeed combat, but it did give an advantage to those who used it in that particular environment. And that, for me, is what is most exciting. It's the type of what they are, and I've always wanted to know more about them, who made them, how many were made, where they were used, who designed them. So this is why I have been fascinated by it, and as a consequence I have written the first of a series of articles which you can find in the Arms and Armour Journal on the 32 Welrod, which is quite an in-depth examination of this particular model. When it comes to how we should use the Welrod, the documentation and the user manuals are quite clear on the suggested ways of using these. You should hold the gun by the grip, and then the barrel by the other hand, and then you can point it towards your target. You hopefully should be able to hit a 2-inch target at 10 to 12 meters. The weapon is designed also with a concave muzzle, so it could be placed up against a target and fired that way. In effect, really close work. One of the advantages of having a concave muzzle is there's a bit of space for gases to expand, not much, but a little, and it allows a much more efficient use of your suppressor. Thank you for watching. This is Up in Arms, and these particular items, along with many other interesting and extraordinary weapons, not just firearms, can be found here at the Royal Armouries. Slay! You really should come and visit.
Enjoy a goated day out.
If you want to support us, you can find different methods of supporting us online. And I am most grateful that you've taken the time to watch and listen to me. I am Mark Murray-Flutter. I'm the Senior Curator for Firearms here. And I wish you all a good day, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
See you soon, chat. Slay.